The story will focus on a period in early American history often overlooked for its sheer strangeness and the profound moral and political compromises made by the nation's founders. The forgotten Whiskey War and the radical, precarious years of the early American Republic, 1791 to 1794. The Republic's first shiver, a tale of whiskey, rebellion, and the founding father who nearly became a king. What if the first great crisis of the United States wasn't over liberty, but over a bottle of rye? In 1794, the young American Republic, scarcely 5 years old, stood on the absolute brink of implosion. A brutal, defiant insurgency had taken root in the remote western frontier, not against a king, but against its own government. This was no scattered band of farmers. It was a disciplined, radicalized army, demanding that the new nation honor the very ideals it had just fought a revolution to secure. The stakes were impossibly high. President George Washington, the man who had laid down a crown, was forced to raise an army of 13,000 men and personally lead them into battle against his own people. This is the true, astonishing story of the Whiskey Rebellion, a forgotten civil war that tested whether the United States would survive its own birth. Part 1. The Tax on Grain and the Scars of War. Chapter 1. The Curse of Liberty. The year is 1791. Philadelphia, the temporary capital, buzzed with the nervous energy of a nation that felt less united every day. The air, thick with the smell of horse manure and ambition, offered little comfort to those in power. In the handsome, high-ceilinged office of the Treasury Department, a man named Alexander Hamilton, sharp-featured, impossibly driven, and with a mind like a steel trap, was wrestling the nation into financial existence. Hamilton faced a staggering problem: debt. The Revolutionary War had been won on credit, and now America owed vast sums to France, to Dutch bankers, and, most controversially, to its own citizens, many of whom had been paid for their military service with worthless paper bonds. Hamilton's solution was audacious, brilliant, and, as many would soon discover, brutally pragmatic. The federal government would assume all the state's debts, unifying the country's finances, and then pay it off. But to pay debt, one must have revenue. Land sales were slow. Tariffs on imports were insufficient. Hamilton needed a source of income that was both reliable and direct. His eyes, perpetually focused on the bottom line, settled on a familiar commodity that could be taxed at its point of production: spirits. On March 3, 1791, Congress passed the excise tax on distilled spirits, better known as the whiskey tax. For the wealthy merchants of the coastal cities, this was a small, reasonable nuisance. For the farmers, the pioneers and settlers of the great western expanse, from the valleys of Pennsylvania to the clearings of Kentucky, it was a dagger aimed at the heart of their economy. To understand their fury, one must understand the western frontier. Imagine the year-long journey over the Appalachian Mountains, a nightmare of broken axles, impassable mud, and the constant chilling threat of Native American conflict. A farmer in western Pennsylvania, on the wrong side of that mountain range, had a single major export: grain. Selling raw corn or rye was financially ruinous. A wagon load of grain might fetch a pittance in Philadelphia, and getting it there would cost more than the product was worth. But if that grain was distilled into whiskey, a miracle occurred. The volume shrank drastically, the shelf life became indefinite, the value soared. Whiskey was not a luxury, it was the only reliable form of currency. It was used to pay field hands, to barter for supplies, and to settle debts. A barrel of rye whiskey was more valuable and more transportable than gold. The new tax was structured to favor large eastern distilleries, which could afford the per-gallon fee and the complicated paperwork. It crushed the small, independent farmer distillers of the West, who often paid the tax not in cash, which they barely had, but in a portion of their already produced whiskey, a significant bite out of their meager profits. "This is not a tax," one settler, a former Revolutionary War captain, was heard to roar. "This is tyranny wearing a coat of blue." They had just overthrown a king over a tax on tea. Now they were being taxed by a government they had fought to create over their only viable means of survival. The scars of the revolution were still fresh, and the people of the frontier, accustomed to self-reliance and quick to anger, felt the familiar, dangerous pull of betrayal.
Chapter 2. The Fire in Mingo Creek. The epicenter of the rage was the rugged, unincorporated land around Mingo Creek, Pennsylvania. Here, the rhetoric was less about constitutional law and more about direct action. These were people who lived hard and died young, accustomed to fighting Native American tribes for every acre, and who saw the federal tax collector as merely another hostile intruder. The movement had a surprising, charismatic leader, a well-read and fiercely eloquent man named David Bradford. Bradford was an ambitious lawyer and a powerful speaker who saw the tax as a mortal threat to the independent spirit of the frontier. He began organizing Mingo Creek associations, which were essentially political clubs but functioned as militias in all but name. Their purpose was singular: to refuse to pay the tax and to violently oppose anyone who attempted to enforce it. The methods of enforcement were not subtle. Tax collectors were intercepted on lonely roads, tarred and feathered, stripped naked, and chased out of town. Their horses were mutilated, their tax records burned. A particularly potent symbol of the movement's brutality was the Liberty Pole, a tall mast erected in defiance, often draped with a flag or banner bearing slogans that would chill the blood of the men in Philadelphia. "No excise, no slavery," and "Death to the revenue men." The defiance escalated sharply in the summer of 1794. The federal government, determined to establish its authority, had issued a large batch of writs summoning the most prominent non-payers to appear in a federal court in Philadelphia. For a farmer in the West, a journey of 300 miles to a hostile court was a guaranteed financial ruin, regardless of the verdict. It was the final straw. On July 16, 1794, a showdown occurred at Bower Hill, the farm of General John Neville, a wealthy local inspector of the revenue who had the audacity to not only enforce the tax, but to profit from it. Neville was a respected man of the community, but his new role had made him a pariah. A large armed mob, led by men from the Mingo Creek Association, surrounded his fortified house. The situation quickly devolved into a full-scale battle. Neville's men returned fire. A local leader of the rebels, Barnabas Reasoner, was shot dead, and another man was wounded. The rebels, enraged by the sight of their fallen comrade, retreated to regroup, swearing vengeance. The next day, the mob returned, now numbering over 500 well-armed men. Neville had fled, but a detachment of 10 U.S. soldiers, sent to protect the property, remained. The rebels offered them quarter if they surrendered the house and its contents. The commanding officer refused. The ensuing battle was a chaotic, hours-long exchange of gunfire. Finally, the rebels managed to set fire to the outbuildings and, eventually, to the main house. The soldiers, choking on smoke and facing total annihilation, surrendered. The rebels did not stop there. They looted everything, then burned Bower Hill to the ground, reducing one of the grandest estates in western Pennsylvania to smoldering ashes. News of the destruction sent a profound shockwave through the capital. This was not a riot. It was an act of open military defiance against the United States government. The founders, sitting in Philadelphia, suddenly realized the terrible truth. Their grand experiment in liberty was already failing. Chapter 3. The Reluctant King. In Philadelphia, the news of the Bower Hill attack brought the city's political elite to a terrified standstill. The men who had fought a revolution now stared into the abyss of civil war. President George Washington, now 64 years old, felt the weight of the nation settle upon him like a shroud. He had spent his retirement years attempting to run a distillery at Mount Vernon, a grim irony that was not lost on him, only to be dragged back to public life to preside over a shaky, often quarrelsome union. Washington was a man obsessed with precedent. He knew that every action he took would be judged by history. Every weakness he showed would become a rule for future presidents to follow. His tax secretary, Alexander Hamilton, saw the crisis as a gift. Hamilton was a Federalist, a true believer in a powerful, centralized government. For him, the rebellion was not just about whiskey, it was a chance to prove the government's supremacy. "The Union will stand or fall by the insurgency," he wrote. He demanded an immediate, overwhelming show of military force. Opposing Hamilton was Thomas Jefferson and the Anti-Federalists, who would become the Democratic-Republican Party. They saw the whiskey tax as a monstrous, unnecessary expansion of federal power, and the Westerners' protest as a noble, albeit rough, expression of revolutionary ideals. He believed that a standing army was the greatest threat to liberty, and feared the precedent of the president using military force against citizens. He wanted conciliation, not war. Washington was torn. He despised the tax in principle, but he feared anarchy more than anything else. The chilling thought was that if he did nothing, the rebellion would spread, the Western territories would secede, and the entire structure of the United States would collapse. It would prove the European monarchs correct that republicanism was inherently weak and incapable of self-governance. On August 7, 1794, Washington issued a proclamation commanding the rebels to disperse. He sent peace commissioners to negotiate, offering amnesty in exchange for an oath of loyalty. The Mingo Creek men scornfully rejected the offer. Their defiance was absolute. Left with no other choice, Washington did the unthinkable. Using the new Militia Act of 1792, he issued the call. 13,000 men, more than the number he had commanded at the decisive Battle of Yorktown, were to be raised from the militias of Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Maryland, and Virginia. The President of the United States was preparing for war against his own citizens. Then he made a decision that astonished the world. On a cold autumn morning, in a spectacular display of military pageantry, George Washington mounted his horse and personally rode out to take command of the army. No sitting American president has ever done so since. The founding father who had voluntarily given up the power of a king was now exercising the ultimate, terrifying power of a commander-in-chief, leading a force into the field to prevent the nation from tearing itself apart. The world watched breathless to see if the reluctant king would save his republic or destroy the revolutionary principle on which it was built.